Alrighty, right. Let me just test. All right, that works. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Hello to our next genetics. Oh gosh, genetics? No, plant anatomy class. Genetics is a little later. Hello there. To our next plant anatomy class in fall 2025, post Thanksgiving break. Today is Monday, December 1st, 2025. It is snowing outside, and here is your quickly attendance code. Gonna miss the quickly attendance codes for this semester. This is the third to last code. 8972. Please log in on that number. All right. I hope you guys had a good Thanksgiving break. Some interesting botanical discussions on the family table. Here is a brief reminder of what we're going to do this week. This week, during the lecture, we're going to cover flower anatomy. I hope to get through that flower anatomy part today and Wednesday, so that on Friday we can do a final special session in lecture, namely that I give about 20 minutes of introduction on fruit anatomy. It's going to be relatively straightforward and simple. And then we actually try out a few fruits and try to identify what kind of tissues you're looking at with a few samples. So Friday is going to be a day where, by the way, the topic on Friday will obviously not be on the final exam anymore. So Friday is going to be just let's use some anatomical knowledge and see what we can identify in terms of fruits. But today and Wednesday is still going to be about flowers. That's general stuff. That's general. That's genuine topic. That was for the lectures. For the labs, we have our final presentation on Thursday. And I have already opened up online the submission parts because, yes, it's true. You'll please then step up on Thursday, and explain a few of the slides. In fact, I'm going to ask you to please explain a total of 4 slides, or 4 pictures, respectively. I know we only have produced a few slides, but feel free to show maybe 1 slide and 3 of the annotated pictures, and explain to us live here, or explain to the rest of the class, including me, what you see on these images. But in parallel, I need a few of these things uploaded. So this is why I have created the folder Student Portfolios here. And I'm asking you, so the first portfolio part we did back in October, you might remember that was before the mid-break, the mid-semester grades, the midterm grades. So that is already done. But these 3 folders here or more specifically, rather, these 2 folders, they're still relevant. I'm asking you to please upload at least 1 image of a microscopy slide. and then at least 3 images of labeled drawings/photographs. I hope you took the opportunity not past Thursday, but the week before when I was in the conference to, because my graduate student was here and she turned on the microscope so you could take pictures. Now they're due, okay, on Thursday. So please take that opportunity to upload these aspects. All right. And other than that, on Thursday, we just meet and again, you do your presentations and we talk about it. I ask a few questions. You guys should also ask questions just so that we are all on the same page so we understand that every person can talk about the plant anatomy knowledge and interpret what they see, at least the basics. After all, that was the point of the class. All right. This is the program for this week. And let's jump back into theory. Hold on a second. Where is mouse pointer? Here it is. So the next 2 days will be all about flower anatomy and plant reproduction. You'll be able to explain, and quite frankly, that probably overlaps strongly with what you have done in introductory botany. You'll be able to explain that there is this alteration of generations in land plants. And you'll be able to say, what is the sporophyte? What is the gametophyte? But this time around, we also want to observe the anatomy of the sporophyte and the gametophyte. You'll see that the sporophyte has exactly the anatomy that we have talked about so far, namely roots, stem, leaf system. Whereas the gametophyte, in most cases, will be relatively undifferentiated, parenchyma throughout. We'll talk about the male and the female gametophyte specifically in flowering plants, where you will see that they're highly reduced. Maybe you already know what the name for the male gametophyte is in flowering plants. I'm sure you know it in spring when you have your allergies. Pollen, that's the male gametophyte. Obviously not very big, highly reduced. And we'll also talk about a few key structures from the flowers from the anatomical side. For example, we're talking about a cross-section of the gynecium, a cross-section of the andrecium, and understand what kind of tissues we find within these male and female parts of flowers. All right, so let's jump right into it with this alteration of generations, or what is casually called the life cycle of plants. But again, the alteration of generations, that's actually a better word. And what we have in most land plants, except for the mosses, is that the diploid phase, which you see here nicely, all that is diploid phase in its full glory. That is the dominant phase in most land plants. Okay, diploid phase only, the tiny little growing. I don't know if you can see, here's a little side branch with leaves coming out from the ginger. Diploid structure only. If you turn around, you'll see diploid, and all our little house plants here. Except, this is why I'm going to drag you over here. Bring you along the screen. Except that one here. This one has primarily diploid tissue too. You see the beautiful sporophyte. But in the center of these flowers, you would see a little bit of gametophytic tissue too, but only in the center of the flowers and only if you were to take a microscope out. So this plant is again almost exclusively diploid tissue, because the haploid tissue is small and in most plants reduced to a few dozen to maybe a few hundred cells only. So something that you would only see under the microscope. Of course, you know from this generation cycle that, like this terminology, the sporophyte produces the sporangia, and then with the help of the meiosis produces the spores. The gametophyte has the gametangia, and with the help of mitosis produces gametes, right? That's probably something you remember from your introductory botany classes. So the sporophyte is among the higher land plants the dominant part. It has roots, stem, leaf system, and you would find all these tissues. The gametophyte is the much smaller part. It's undifferentiated. We would only find parenchyma in there. Take, for example, here this fern sporophyte. Have you ever seen a fern sporophyte? You see it right here. Who has seen a fern sporophyte? Who has seen a fern? Then you have seen a fern sporophyte. It was a trick question, okay? Like what you see as a fern is the sporophyte. You might not have noticed it as that, but of course it's just like here. It's a sporophyte. However, who has seen a fern gametophyte? They're difficult to see. In fact, if you look at the small picture down here, you would see a person here holding between thumb and the next digit. You'd see a tiny, tiny, tiny little gametophyte. This is what it looks like under the microscope. The gametophyte, this is the female gametophyte. This would be the male gametophyte. It really only has parenchymatic tissue, like small little structures that are there for the reproduction. Those are the female gamete producing parts. These are the male gamete producing parts, but they're basically sitting just in two parenchyma lobes. And the diameter here is maybe 2 or 3 millimeters at the most. That's it. That's the gametophyte. And for land plants, this is a big gametophyte. Okay. So in the flowering plants, these were the ferns because there we can actually see them. But now in the flowering plants, here, what would be the male gametophyte? The pollen grain. What would be the female gametophyte? Before I show this on the screen, do you guys know what would be the female gametophyte? Now we understand the pollen grain of these flowers, although not all of these flowers are bisexual. Some of these flowers are unisexual here, but where would the female gametophyte in such an individual flower be? What would correspond to the female gametophyte? You know what? Why don't we together? This is an important part. I'm trying to kind of like mix what you hopefully have remember from introductory botany with our new anatomical part. Let us together draw a flower, shall we? Do you still remember some flower morphology? You might remember, you know what? I actually have a gonna use this as a little template for you. Let's go from the outside inwards. You might remember we have 4 whorls in every flower, right? We have, so if this is the base of the flower, we would have typically green sepals. This is, of course, a flower just from the side. Then colorful petals. Then the male part of the flowers, the stamens. And in the center, the female part of the flower, the carpel or pistil with its old name. So sepals, petals, stamens, and the central carpel or carpels, the plural. So we already know, I'm going to draw this now in a different color. that the male gametophytes are produced and initially located here in the anthers. The male gametophytes are the individual pollen grains, extremely small, consisting only of 2 cells, literally. Each pollen grain is not 1 cell, but actually 2 cells. Now, correspondingly, so this is the male gametophyte, or the male gametophytes, plural. What would be the female gametophytes? Of course, it can only be in the carpel, right? But where exactly? You're right, you're right. Base of the exactly. This base part here would be the ovary, and the ovary contains multiple, as we call it, ovules, each of which can turn into a seed later on. And these ovules will produce the gametophyte, the female gametophyte. It's not that the entire ovule is the gametophyte, but the ovules produce the gametophyte. Now, why do I mention this here? I mean, yes, we're in a plant anatomy course, and we will look at cross sections of both the anthers as well as the carpel. But we're mentioning this here specifically for the flowering plants, because flowering plants have one thing that, for some weird reason, in biology is not mentioned enough. It's the one evolutionary step that made most of life on the planet possible, the way we see it now anyways. And certainly that has shaped our evolution much, much more than we realize, even though it occurred way before any primates ever existed. Namely, the concept of double fertilization. That is one of the key features of the angiosperms. What is the double fertilization? Double fertilization means that from the male gametophyte, one of the nuclei will fertilize an egg cell in the female gametophyte, sure, to produce the zygote. But that's not the only fertilization. There's a second fertilization going on where the second sperm cell nucleus fuses with one of the central polar nuclei, as we call them, to produce the endosperm, the nutrient-rich tissue that is surrounding the embryo in any seed. And it's that double fertilization that makes flowering plants, I mean, one of the things that makes flowering plants so effective. This is why they have spread across so many regions in the world. And quite frankly, for human nutrition, that is the critical thing, you know? Any grain that you eat, you're eating essentially endosperm. You know, it's like, who has had some bread in the morning or some oats in the morning? I'm sure you had some breakfast today. You know what you ate at that breakfast? No, you didn't have. Except you'd be like, didn't have breakfast. All right, you had some coffee in the morning, maybe? Not okay, good. Maybe some people were fasting, but that's okay. But if you had any, okay, yesterday evening you had some food. At the very least, on Thanksgiving you had some. You had some bread. What you ate there was endosperm. Endosperm from grains, primarily grasses, monocots, but endosperm nonetheless. So this double fertilization is absolutely essential for human nutrition. This is also why we're going to look at cross-sections of what exactly happens during that double fertilization. But for now, the important thing was to remind ourselves what was the male gametophyte, what was the female gametophyte. And just so that we close the loop, basically, just let us remember what happens after that double fertilization here. These female gametophytes in the ovules, one per ovule, after they have been fertilized, will grow into embryo and endosperm respectively, so thus forming a seed, and that seed is the new sporophyte generation. Okay, the seed is already the new sporophyte, thus completing the circle. This is why we call it an alteration of generations. So this step here completes the alteration. All right. If you're more of a visual person like me, you need to see such a male and a female gametophyte. Here would be the male gametophyte, the pollen grain of flowering plants. Again, most people would say, oh yeah, look there, one cell. No, actually it's two cells. It has one generative and one vegetative cell pushed into that pollen grain together. That vegetative cell will be later on responsible for producing a pollen tube. Its nucleus will disintegrate. The generative cell will mitotically divide later on one more time. And the two nuclei that the generative cell forms will be the ones that double fertilize the ovule. Okay? Just that generative cell one. This will be the one that double fertilizes the two cells of, well, the female gametophyte here. The female gametophyte up there consists of, let's look at this part here, consists of 7 cells with, interestingly, 8 nuclei in total. But let's stick with the 7-cell part. So the male gametophyte, 2 cells large, the female gametophyte, 7 cells large. Now, isn't that a reduction in gametophyte size? They only contain like a handful of cells, if at all, whereas the great majority is sporophyte tissue. Which brings me to a question for you. If the dominant sporophyte is so successful that basically every plant you look at is sporophytic tissue, why do we still have gametophytes? What's the purpose of gametophytes then? Do you see the point? Beautiful sporophyte tissue, sporophyte throughout, with, a few small cell clusters here, gametophyte tissue, like the pollen, 2 cells only per pollen, male gametophyte, and 7 cells in each ovule, that is the female gametophyte. But, the proportions are totally off. 99.99999999999% sporophytic tissue, and then 0.000000001% gametophytic tissue in such a plant individual. Why even bother with the gametophytes? I herewith propose, let us get rid of gametophytes. Do I have a second? Hopefully not. Why are gametophytes important? Yeah, in what way? You're quite right. If you abolish the gametophytic stage, it would be akin to abolishing our sperm and egg cell stage. How exactly is reproduction supposed to work? We could clone ourselves from somatic cells, sure. I mean, we vertebrates barely cannot really do it. Plants wouldn't have a problem. I mean, think about this example here. We had that little rhizome part of the ginger. I just broke it off, put it in there, and before we know it, basically in the new year, we're going to have a complete new ginger individual. So yes, clonal reproduction would be a possibility for plants. So plants could theoretically abolish their gametophytic stage and just propagate with the help of the sporophytic stage. But would that be a good idea? No, not at all. That would be a terrible idea because it would mean no more genetic diversity, only clonal reproduction. And that's not going to go well. for even any intermediary phase. So to answer the devil's advocate question, no, we cannot abolish the gametophytic phase because it's the only phase that results from meiosis, and thus the only phase that gives us a reshuffling of genetic information. It is true that within plants, just like within vertebrates, or just like within animals, period, the gametophytic phase has been stronger and stronger and stronger reduced. But it still needs to be there. It will always be there as long as sex or reproduction is around. But this brings me to a second question here, second follow-up, or a follow-up. Can you guys think of a reason as to why it's always the gametophyte that is being strongly reduced? I mean, you see it in us animals. Our gametophytic phase, sperm and egg cell, it's strongly reduced to one cell only. In plants, this was a parallel evolution in land plants, that the gametophytic stage was also strongly reduced. That it's true, the flowering plants don't have it down to one cell only, but they're close. They have 2 cells for the male gametophyte and 7 cells for the female gametophytes. It's almost down to 1 cell only. But why is it always the gametophyte that kind of like gets whacked and reduced? Couldn't we also have the inverse? That the sporophyte is the one that is small and the gametophyte is the one that's walking, talking, and being large? Or to put it differently, why does it always have to be this part of the generation cycle that's the dominant one, and this one that's the small, few-celled one? Couldn't we switch this around? Lawrence probably knows. You took my intro bio course. Yeah. Well, the truth is, plants do that. You know, in terms of algae, there are plenty of algae out there where the gametophytic stage is the dominant one, and the sporophytic stage is the small, reduced one. Who has had sushi recently? Anybody? Okay. I'll take you as an example. What was the sushi wrapped by this like darkish, almost papery like cover, right? Typically what sushi is wrapped in, right? You know what you ate there? Generally, I mean, seaweed, yeah, but what is seaweed? Seaweed are nothing but algae, right? In this case, it was a brown algae. It was dried and processed, but still it was a brown algae. It once grew in the ocean. And this particular algae species has the gametophyte as the dominant one. Porphyra yezuensis, that's what you ate, has the gametophyte as the dominant and the sporophyte as the reduced stage. So you ate gametophytic tissue in this case. So to summarize, it's true that the land plants have the sporophytic stage as the dominant one, except for the mosses. But that's not necessarily true for all plants. All right, with that, this was our little introduction to plant reproduction, kind of like to set the base or to set the stage to remind you of the different phases and what is a gametophyte, what is a sporophyte. Can you help me with a few clicker questions here? And then we actually jump into the flower itself. We'll look at the anatomy of the flower. All right, which feature distinguishes the sporophyte from the gametophyte in land plants? you need the code? Here it would be large again. Which feature distinguishes the sporophyte from the gametophyte in seed plants? Notice here I'm mentioning seed plants because this answer would not be true for the mosses. The mosses have it the other way around. But in the seed plants, meaning the ferns, the gymnosperms, or the angiosperms, the answer is correct. Person voted the sporophyte is smaller than the gametophyte and lacks organs. Or another person said the sporophyte is larger than the gametophyte and has differentiated organs. Well, which of those is it for the seed plants? What do you see here? Sporophyte or gametophyte? I mean, it's true you see both, but what do you see predominantly? Or said differently, what do you see exclusively here? Because this one doesn't have any flowers. Sporophyte or is it gametophyte? We need, okay, perfect. The sporophyte is, of course, what you see here. The sporophyte in land plants is the dominant one. Just remember, land plants are basically like us in this regard. We are sporophytic tissue. I mean, we're not sporophytic. We're diploid tissue, which corresponds to sporophytic tissue in plants. All right, here's a second one. In the plant life cycle, which process restores the sporophyte generation? This now refers to exactly this alteration of generation. Which process restores the diploid stage from the haploid stage, or the sporophytic stage from the gametophytic stage? Same thing. Are you sure? Is it meiosis that restores the diploid stage? Meiosis produces gametes, produces haploid tissue. Now we are looking for the process that restores the diploid stage, that produces the little zygote here in the ovules. Exactly. It's the fusion of the gametes that produces the sporophytic stage. So whoever voted for meiosis, nope, you might want to retract this and put your vote up here. All right. Oh, there's a third one. I didn't. No, that's it. Okay, this was a little reminder. Let us now look at the flower per se, because I'll assume from now onwards that you know when we speak about, say, for example, the base of the flower, you know it's of course sporophytic tissue, or the petals, it's sporophytic tissue. But as soon as we're talking about the ovules and the ovary, you know we're talking about gametophytic tissue. Or like the pollen, the anthers, we're talking about gametophytic tissue. So such a cross-section of a flower, or actually that's not a cross-section, that's a longitudinal section of a flower, will remind us of what? That a flower at the end of the day, here's such a little flower, is nothing else but actually a side branch in plants. A side branch that has been strongly compressed and partially colorized. Because the leaves are arranged in what we call whorls. We have a base whorl consisting of typically the sepals. Then another base whorl consisting of the petals. The petals are typically the ones that are attractive and shiny, so that pollinators are attracted. And then we have two central whorls that are reproductive for male and female reproductive organs, or said differently, for the gametophytic stage. So this is just a review, okay? I'm just making sure that when we talk about some of these cross sections that you remember these terms. Again, you probably, hopefully, had them in introductory botany. Down here would be the stalk of the flower, the pedicel. The base of the flower is called the receptacle. This is what swells and becomes juicy and fleshy in strawberries or in apples, because neither strawberries nor apples are genuine fruits. Well, they do have a fruit part to them, but what you eat is not actually fruit tissue, and neither strawberries nor apples, as you will learn on Friday. Then we have these sepals here, which in the dicots are green. In the monocots, it's not as easy. Then you have the petals, of course. Everybody knows about those. And if you want to talk about all the petals, you would speak of the corolla, and all the sepals, you would speak of the calyx. But those are two terms that I don't think we need in this class, just in the case it ever came up. More important is now the generative part. So these are individual stamens. Do you remember what such a stamen is subdivided as, or subdivided into? Any stamen would consist of the anther part up here. This is where the meiosis takes place. And these long filaments. These filaments are kind of like the stalks where the anthers sit on. Vice versa, with the carpel, here this would be one central carpel, but it could be multiple fused carpels. The terminology would be the same. The top of the carpel, where the actual pollen arrives, is called the stigma. Then the long tube, where the pollen tube has to grow down, is called the style. And the bottom part, where the ovules are located, is the ovary. And it is that ovary part that will become fleshy in most fruits and that we eat as fruits. Okay, so this part here is what, say, 60% of human nutrition is all about. All right, so this was kind of like a little review of the terminology. Let's talk about a brief side aspect here. Namely, do you remember throughout the entire semester, we've talked about the difference between monocots and dicots in terms of the anatomy? Well, here is one last aspect of monocot and dicot difference, because the two differ strongly in their flower morphology. I mean, both are flowering plants and both produce flowers, but dicots typically have a number of sepals and petals that is not, let me repeat, not a multiple of 3. Instead, they have 2 or 4 or 5 petals and sepals respectively. Typically, the number of sepals, the number of petals is identical. Doesn't have to be always the case, but it oftentimes is. Likewise, the number of stamens in carpels is not a multiple of 3, but 2 or 4 or 5. This is all true for the dicots. Monocots, on the other hand, they have a multiple of 3 in their whorls. Now, we don't call it sepals and petals there because we don't actually have that differentiation. This is why we call the vegetative parts of flowers in monocots the tepals. But nonetheless, the tepals have 3 or a multiple of 3 in monocots. And same with the stamens and the carpels. They are a multiple of 3, or they are 3 or a multiple of 3 in the monocots. So, under those conditions, what do I have here? Is this a monocot or a dicot? Please, have a look closer. Have a look at the flowers here. You can probably guess if this is a monocot or a dicot from many of the other features that you've learned this semester. Just be careful of the nasty little prickles here. They're neither spines nor thorns. They are prickles, like in roses. But feel free to pluck one of the flowers off, and or maybe it comes off already.
Is this like one flower? Or is this?
No, yeah. Would you have the entire thing up there would be an inflorescence, a cluster of flowers. Let's pluck one. I mean, feel free to. Nobody's going to see them over Christmas here, anyways. Feel free to pluck off the entire inflorescence, and okay, now you have 2 flowers there. And if you want, separate them. So, what do you think? You could hand one to somebody else. What do you have here? Do you have a monocot or a dicot?
This is for.
Okay, 4 petals. Yep. Any other argument as to why this is a dicot? You're quite right. You're right. So, in terms of the flower morphology, we can see a total of 4. Actually, what we see here is because this is in the family U4 BAC, which their evolution is crazy. But here we have 2 large petals, and here the sepals are actually colorful as well, which is a little unusual, but the U4 BAC is not impossible. So actually, this is all a multiple of this is a 2 situation where kind of like you have 2 sepals, 2 petals, and then a multiple of 2 or an even number of stamens and an even number of fused carpels. But yeah, dicot from this perspective. Any other argument as to why this is a dicot?
Veining on the leaves.
Yes, correct, right? The veins on the leaves.
It's not like this. It's like what's that?
Exactly, it's net-like, not parallel. One more aspect as to why this is probably a dicot. You don't have any thorns here. Those are prickles.
It's like the leaves fall off. Leaves scars.
Okay, and it is true that there are monocots that do shed leaves. That's true, but they're relatively rare. Most monocots keep their leaves. Remember that intercalary meristem that makes the leaves grow and grow and grow and grow. Clearly, they shed their leaves. No point of the intercalary meristem here. So all these are indicators that yes, this is a dicot. With the flower part being the most obvious. Excellent. In this regard, can you help me with a little bit of the terminology here? The terminology is important because we're gonna, in a few minutes, or maybe on Wednesday, we're going to look at some cross sections of the anthers and cross sections of the gynoecium, the carpels, and then I'll just basically tell you, oh yeah, you have a cross section of this, and if you don't know the terminology, then it might be confusing at what you look at here. So I blacked out or blued out some of the terms here. Oh yeah, by the way, is this a monocot or a dicot? Dicot? Let's see. Let's cut the petals together, okay? By the way, are they petals? This tells them where the sepal. Let's call them the vegetative parts, okay? 1, 2, probably something there in the back. 3, 4, 5, 6. Likewise, in terms of the stamens here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Would be a multiple of 3, right? That is, of course, a monocot. That's iris, a monocot. But can you help me with some of these terms? Let's take the generative parts down here. Sorry, the generative parts down here. What is that of a stamen? So obviously we have one stamen here. This part would be the carpel would be the female part in the center. This would be one stamen here, and it's subdivided into the anther, exactly, and the filament. The gynecium here in the center. You just said stigma. That blue part here would correspond to the stigma, and that part here would correspond to the exactly. That would be the style. See how long that style is? A pollen grain that falls here has to grow all the way down. The pollen tube has to grow all the way down here before fertilization is done. Many times over its own size. So, by the way, here are the respective terms for it. Let's do one last thing here today. You know that any of these worlds can be fused. This creates in flower morphology and flower anatomy oftentimes confusion because people, when they make cuts and they don't have a picture of the flower ahead of time, they're like, why is a mesh here of this tissue and that tissue blended together? And people are always confused, like, what is that? This is why flower anatomy is actually quite difficult. It's because any parts of these flowers can be fused. Here's a simple example. For example, if all the petals, you can see you have 5 petals here, thus a dicot. If all these petals are separate from one another and they only converge down here at the receptacle, it's not that difficult. But what if, like here in convolvulus, which is also dicot, it has 5 petals that are, however, fused. If you were to make a cross-section at the bottom, like close here to the receptacle, a little bit above the receptacle, you wouldn't really know what you're looking at because you have no physical separation of the petals, the sepals, and the receptacle. It's all fused into one mesh at the bottom. You can also have fusions across worlds, because so far I've shown you what if all the petals, for example, or some of the petals fuse. But it could also be that, say, for example, the petals and the stamens fuse. Yes, weirdly enough, the vegetative and the generative part of a flower can fuse so that suddenly it's the petal that kind of produces the pollen because the stamens have been included in the petal, have fused with the petal. This part, the fusion, is actually in flowering plant evolutionary history an indication of more derived species. So whenever you look at plants that have strong fusions in their flowers, you're typically not looking at the most basal plants of the flowering plants, but the more derived ones. It's a pretty good general rule. Take this example. Here you would have in the center, you would have a flower without any fusion. What about the one over there on the right-hand side? Does that look like any fusion? You have such a longitudinal section. You have the nice carpel here with the ovary and the individual ovules here, each of which will develop into seed if fertilized. What about the stamens, though? Doesn't this look a little weird to you? Exactly. The stamens here seem to be not connected to the base of the flower, but they are fused with the petals. And the petals themselves are fused with the sepals. So you have here a fusion of sepals, petals, and stamens. So the bottom here, if you were to make a cross section right here, if you were to make a cross section right at this point, you would not be able to differentiate any sepal from petal to stamen. It would look identical. All right, last one, and then we close it for today. Can you see any fusion here within whorls or any fusion across whorls?
E.
E would be, really, E?
That's it, B.
B is a good one. What is B? What kind of fusion is B? You're quite right. B is a good one. Exactly. We have the stamens here fused with the petals and the sepals. That's a good one. But I see a second one here.
It looks like there's multiple ovaries.
True, there are multiple ovaries, but I don't think they are fused in any way. What about F down here? It's true that, I mean, well, it's not 100% clear, you know, they might be fused here and here and here and here, or they might go individually down. I mean, we're only looking at this from the top, but certainly G here. You're probably wondering what G is. These three petals here, they seem to be separate, but we have at least two more here that are fused, and this part here is also a fusion of multiple petals. This is an orchid flower, and orchid flowers have multiple fused petals in a very intricate form in order to mimic other, especially female pollinators, so that the male pollinators confuse those, come here and try to copulate with these fused flowers. In any event, you have multiple fusions here, and with that, we'll finish. And on Wednesday, we're then looking into the anatomy of the anthers and the ovary, respectively. And we actually see like the fertilization live on microscopic images. All right, with that, have a good one, and I'll see you on Thursday.
For the pictures that we